The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. Rewritten and Retold by Beyond the Billabong. Part 1. The Assassin's Blade. In the halls of the Colin Palace, light poured in from flickering torches in their sconces, and noble voices murmured amid the distant melody of a flute. Tonight was a celebration. King Gavilar of Alethkar had nearly achieved what no one had done before. He had united the High Princes under a single rule, restoring a strength to the kingdom not seen since the time of the Knights. Yet amid the revelry walked Seth Sonson Vallano, the assassin in white, with a far different purpose. Moving like a shadow, his sandaled feet barely made a sound on the stone as he stalked through the corridors. Dressed in pure white, the traditional garb of his people, though recognizable by few in these halls, the loose silk allowed for swift movement, with sleeves pressed tightly around his wrists. He had been given his mission, and he intended to complete it. He did not wish to kill, but he had no choice. A truthless obeys without question. Seth inhaled deeply, feeling the cool sphere nestled in his sash as the stormlight within pulsed with barely contained power. The light surged into him, coursing through his veins like liquid fire. His body felt weightless, energy crackling just beneath his skin, and he leaped. The corridor blurred beneath him as he crossed an impossible distance, landing on the wall before springing again. He vaulted through an open archway into the grand chamber. There they were. The nobles turned, gasps and screams cutting through the hum of conversation as Seth landed, crouched. His shard blade materialized from mist in his hand, its long silvery edge gleaming in the flickering torchlight. The guards rushed forward, but they were too late. Moving like an unbridled storm, Seth slid forward, weaving between them as his blade moved through air, armor, and flesh. Unlike ordinary swords, his shard blade passed through steel, slicing effortlessly through weapons and breastplates, and when it contacted flesh, it severed only the soul. The guards fell, their eyes blazing, as their spirits were torn from their bodies. Spinning gracefully, Seth stepped lightly among the falling men. More rushed him, but he was already in motion, lashed upward, defying gravity as he soared toward the ceiling. He pressed against it, flipped, and struck downward with his blade. A man screamed before going silent as Seth landed amid the carnage. Chaos erupted in the chamber. Nobles fled, their fine robes billowing as they shouted for help, but Seth paid them no heed. His focus was solely on the king. Gavilar Kolian stood on the far side of the room, watching calmly. His deep violet uniform remained pristine despite the bloodshed, and his shard plate shone with golden light. Slowly, he reached to his side and summoned his own blade, which formed from mist into a long, formidable weapon.
So,
the king murmured in a measured tone.
They finally come for me.
Seth inhaled again, drawing more stormlight to fuel his swift movements. Gavilar stepped forward. His shard plate lent him strength and speed beyond that of a normal man, yet Seth was anything but normal. The clash was short and brutal. Gavilar swung his blade with such power that it could shatter stone, but Seth moved with inhuman grace, dodging each attack. He lashed himself backward, then forward again, twisting and striking at the joints of the shard plate. Cracks began to spiderweb across the king's armor, flaring with brilliant white light. The plate was formidable, yet it was failing. Gavilar grunted, stepping back and clutching his side as his movement slowed. Seth pressed forward. With a final decisive strike, his shard blade slipped through an opening at the king's side. Gavilar gasped. His blade fell from his fingers, dissolving into mist. His knees buckled and he collapsed against the wall. Seth caught him and lowered him gently, his hands slick with blood. The king coughed, his breath ragged. His dark, thoughtful eyes met Seth's.
They
Gavilar whispered, his voice barely audible,
must not get it.
fumbling at his belt with trembling fingers. He pressed something into Sheth's hand, a small black sphere with a surface swirling in deep, unnatural light. Seth hesitated as the king's grip tightened on his wrist.
Tell my brother
Gavilar murmured.
he must unite.
His body convulsed, his breath shuddered, and then he went still. Seth exhaled, closing his fingers around the sphere. It was done. Wiping his hand on his robe, he turned and left the chamber, stepping over the scattered bodies. Behind him, the torchlight danced on the shattered remains of Shardplate, and the last king of a unified Alethkar lay dead. Part 2. The Branded Slave. The wagon jolted over rough, uneven ground, its weathered wooden frame groaning under the strain of its load. Chains clattered with each movement, and the slaves cramped inside swayed with every bump. Packed so tightly, there was no space for comfort. Kaladin barely registered the motion. Seated against rusted bars, he gazed upward, his eyes following the slow drift of heavy, storm-laden clouds. A high storm was approaching. The distant, swirling grey sky heralded destruction, its advance subtly marked by an electric hum vibrating in the air. While most men feared high storms, their savage winds and relentless, stone-crushing power, Kaladin had long since become numb. Both fear and hope had been stripped from him long ago. Cold iron shackles encircled his wrists and ankles, scraping his skin raw. Yet these were nothing compared to the real mark of his enslavement, the burning brand etched into his forehead, a permanent testament to his supposed worthlessness. He was now a slave, no longer a soldier, no longer a son, no longer a man, just another body to be bartered. The wagon bucked again, and the man beside him coughed weakly, his ribs nearly visible through broken skin, like a shattered framework. No one spoke. There was nothing left worth saying. Kaladin had abandoned the notion of conversation with his fellow captives long ago. Hoped. Ahead, the horizon stretched wide, a broken, scarred landscape that seemed to go on forever. He already knew where they were taking him. As soon as the wagon ground to a halt, the cracking of whips filled the air.
Move!
A harsh, sharp voice commanded. Kaladin stepped onto the hard, compacted earth, his muscles stiff from days of confinement. Around him, the other slaves stumbled into line, too exhausted to resist as they were herded forward. The first assault on his senses was the stench, a nauseating blend of sweat, filth, and something far fouler. The unmistakable odor of decaying bodies clung to the camp. Before him sprawled the war camp, a sinister mass set upon jagged terrain, like a parasite feasting on the land. Beyond it, the shattered plains sprawled in all directions, a labyrinth of towering plateaus and deep, shadowed chasms. The sight stirred a hollow emptiness in Kaladin's stomach. Bridge crews. He had heard the grim tales of men forced to run under heavy wooden bridges, unarmed, charging into enemy fire as living shields. A slow, agonizing end. A death without purpose. The waiting soldiers wore the colors of High Prince Sadeas, blue and gold, immaculate and untainted by suffering. The officer at their head had a cruel expression and an even crueler tone.
"Welcome to Bridge 4.
He declared, his gaze laced with disdain.
You now belong to High Prince Sadeas.
Kaladin simply remained silent.
You run.
The officer continued, pacing before them.
That is your duty. You carry the bridges so our soldiers may fight. If you fall, another will take your place.
A few slaves murmured their disquiet. Kaladin kept silent, his mind already working through the inevitable. Nearby, a whispered remark reached him.
Bridge 4? I heard it's the worst crew. The ones they send to die.
Kaladin tightened his jaw. He had long accepted his destiny of death, yet he refused to let his existence be empty. Under the brutal sun, Kaladin crouched beneath the weight of a wooden bridge, his fingers gripping the coarse beams. Officers shouted, spurring them on, until suddenly arrows began to pour down. Parshendi warriors stood arranged on a distant plateau, their deep red skin glistening in the unforgiving sunlight. Their odd, rhythmic chants filled the air, like a war song as old as the land. Then, without warning, they loosed their arrows. The sky darkened with the onslaught. Kaladin ran. His muscles burned and his breath came in ragged gasps, yet he pressed on without hesitation. He had seen battle, had stared death in its spiteful face, but this was outright massacre. Men crumpled around him as obsidian-tipped arrows found their marks. A man to his left gasped a strangled cry when a black-fletched arrow lodged in his throat. Another collapsed at his feet, blood oozing from a deep wound in his stomach. Keep moving. Don't stop. The bridge crew reached the edge of a chasm, letting the bridge fall with a thunderous crash. Kaladin stumbled aside as soldiers surged forward, their pristine shard plate glimmering in the daylight as they charged into battle. And in an instant, it was over. The soldiers roared in triumph. The bridgemen silently tallied their dead. Kaladin stood unmoving, his eyes fixed on the fallen, the ones they would abandon. Stormfather. Was this truly all there was? Days blurred into one another. Each dawn ushered in another bridge run, another battle, another count of the dead. The rations were scant, the nights were bitterly cold and restless, the future an empty void. Kaladin learned the names of the survivors, the names of the men who hadn't yet died. Rock, the Horn-Eater, who somehow still managed to laugh amid the despair. Teft, the grizzled veteran with haunted eyes. Moash, fueled by a searing anger at the world. They were all damaged. Kaladin understood the nature of broken things. And yet, he refused to let himself grow close. Not again. Night fell over the war camp, with the wind whispering secrets, carrying the distant scent of rain. Kaladin lay on his back and stared up at the night sky, his mind eerily empty. Then, something small caught his attention. A tiny, glowing figure flitted into view, dancing in the air like a wisp of light. A spren. Kaladin frowned. Spren were common enough. Fire spren, wind spren, even rot spren. But this one was different. It moved with purpose, drifting near his face, watching him with a quiet, unsettling intensity.
You look sad,
It said. Kaladin stiffened. Spren weren't supposed to talk. She watched him as the sky darkened toward dusk, her presence as constant as the weight in his chest.
What's your name?
She asked, perching on the wooden post beside him.
Go away.
Kaladin said sharply. She cocked her head.
That's an unusual name.
He sighed, rubbing his temples.
What's yours?
She hesitated, as if the question had never occurred to her before.
I don't know.
Kaladin sat in silence, staring at the horizon. A heavy stillness had settled over the land, thick and unnatural. The air felt charged, humming with something just beyond the edge of hearing. The air held a strange weight, a distant tension pressing down on his skin. The sky turned the color of bruised steel, though the sun had not yet fully set.
It's coming.
The spren muttered quietly. The first gust of wind rolled through the camp, stirring dust into the air. The slaves rushed for shelter, scrambling into the crude pen, but Kaladin remained where he was, unmoving. The wind picked up, pulling at his ragged clothing, whispering through the wooden beams. The horizon boiled with churning clouds, and then, at last, the wall of rain appeared, a living, writhing thing, devouring the land as it advanced. Lightning split the sky, The air trembled with thunder. The spren flickered beside him, her wings shimmering uneasily. The wind struck with the force of a hammer, nearly knocking him from his feet, but he stood firm. The rain came in sheets, a relentless assault, and through it all, he saw a figure, cloaked, unmoving, a presence untouched by wind or rain, standing as though the storm itself bent around it. Then came the voice. It was not spoken, it was felt, a deep, resonant force that rumbled through the earth and echoed in its bones.
Child of Tanavast.
Darkness swallowed him whole. When he awoke, the storm had passed. The world was quiet, the air thick with the scent of rain and earth. Kaladin lay in the mud, aching but alive. The spren floated above him, her tiny face alight with something close to wonder.
You're different.
She whispered. Kaladin stared up at the clearing sky. He didn't know what she meant, but something inside him had changed. He felt it, a warmth in his chest, a spark of light, a whisper of hope. Part 3. A scholar among nobles. The ship swayed gently in the harbour, its sails filled by the warm Thalen wind. Standing at the railing, Shallan gripped the polished wood as she gazed over Kharbranth, the city of bells. The city spilled down the cliffs toward the sea, its winding alleys woven between towers and domes. The chime of distant bells carried on the breeze. She had finally arrived. Even under the midday sun, her hands felt clammy. This was her moment, her desperate gamble. She had come seeking knowledge, to study under Jasnah Kholin, one of the most brilliant minds of the age, but she had also come to steal from her. Shallan adjusted the satchel at her side and set off through the winding streets toward the Palanaeum, Kharbranth's fabled library where Jasnah resided. The structure loomed high above the city, a bastion of knowledge hoarded like gemstones, its halls holding secrets Shallan could only hope to unravel. Jasnah Kholin was not what Shallan had expected. She had read of the woman's brilliance. Scholars whispered her name with reverence. Light-eyed, noble women scoffed at her unorthodox ways, and kings sought her counsel even as they feared her defiance. She was the daughter of the late King Gavilar Kholin, sister to the reigning king of Alethkar. Born into one of the most powerful houses in Roshar, she had been raised among warriors and monarchs, yet had chosen the path of a scholar rather than that of a queen or general. Jasnah commanded the space around her, seated in a private alcove within the Palanaeum, her posture effortless yet firm. There was something regal in the way she held herself, not in the rehearsed manner of courtly women, but in the quiet authority of a woman who had no need to prove herself. Shallan had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, practiced every plea and counter-argument, but under Jasnah's steady gaze, her words faltered.
You are persistent.
Jasnah remarked, barely glancing up from her writing. Shallan straightened.
I wish to learn from you, Brightness.
I have already denied your request.
Jasnah replied, dipping her pen into ink.
You haven't heard my case properly.
Shallan insisted.
I have studied natural philosophy, mathematics, history. I can be of use to you.
Jasnah sighed, finally setting down her pen. She studied Shallan in silence, eyes sharp with consideration.
Knowledge is not a prize to be won, child. It is a burden. It requires truth, even when that truth is unwelcome.
Her voice was steady, deliberate.
Are you prepared for that?
Shallan hesitated.
I want to learn. I can handle the burden.
Jasnah studied her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she stood.
Very well. Prove to me that you are ready for true knowledge.
She led Shallan through the winding corridors of the Palanaeum to a secluded chamber, lit only by the soft glow of infused gemstones. The room smelled of parchment and dust, the air heavy with something else, something ancient. Yasna gestured toward a pedestal where a simple goblet of water rested.
Tell me what you see.
Shallan frowned.
A goblet of water?
Yasna's lips quirked slightly.
Observe.
She reached out and placed her fingers against the goblet's surface. Light flared, a brief pulse of energy that sent a ripple through the air. The goblet shimmered, and then, in an instant, it was no longer glass and water, but solid stone. As if it had always been that way. Shallan gasped, stepping back instinctively.
Soul casting?
Yasna folded her arms.
The world is not as simple as men assume. What you perceive is only a shadow of what truly is.
Shallan's mind raced.
You soul cast without a fabrial?
Yasna raised an eyebrow.
Is that unexpected?
It was. The process of soul casting required fabrials, intricate devices infused with captured spren. To transform matter without one, without gemstones wired for the purpose, should have been impossible.
Everything has a nature, Shallan.
Yasna continued.
A truth it believes about itself. Soul casting is the act of persuading it to be something else.
She gestured toward the stone goblet.
This object believed itself to be water. I convinced it otherwise.
Shallan's breath caught.
You spoke to it?
Of a sort.
Yasna's expression was unreadable.
One does not force change. One must negotiate it.
Shallan's head swam with possibilities. She had come here to steal a fabrial from Yasna, believing it to be the secret to her power. But this was something else entirely.
I want to see the world as you do.
Shallan said softly. Shallan swallowed, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She was here to save her family, to steal what was necessary. But now, doubt crept in. What if the soulcaster she sought wasn't the secret at all? Yasna studied her for another long moment. Then, at last, she nodded.
Very well, you may stay. But remember, knowledge is not given, it is earned.
Shallan exhaled, relief washing over her. She was one step closer to redemption, one step closer to saving her family. And yet, deep inside, she could not shake the feeling that she had just stepped onto a path far more dangerous than she had ever anticipated. Part 4 of Kings and Lords. The sky churned with stormlight, its swirling masses of dark clouds edged with silver, where distant lightning arced through the heavens. The winds howled over the war camp, rattling tents, tearing loose banners, and carrying the scent of rain and stone across the barren expanse of the shattered plains. Dalinar Kholin stood at the edge of his balcony, his hands gripping the chilled stone railing as he gazed out across the fractured landscape. The war camps sprawled below, a sea of flickering lanterns and campfires. Beyond them lay the plateaus, broken, jagged things that stretched into the horizon like the remains of a shattered world. This was his battlefield, the domain of kings and high princes, a place where warriors fought and died for gem hearts, where alliances were tenuous and ambition burned hotter than any forge. Yet as he stood there, his mind was not on war. The visions had come again. Stronger this time, more vivid, not mere dreams, but something more. Memories of a world long past, a whisper of voices not his own. They had shown him knights in glowing armor, blades that burned with power, cities that stretched toward the heavens, and through it all, that voice, deep and commanding, a single command that echoed in his mind, even now.
Unite them.
His fingers tightened against the stone, his breath slow and measured. What did it mean? Unite the High Princes? Unite Alethkar? Or something greater? Something beyond the borders of a fractured kingdom? The sound of boots on stone pulled him from his thoughts. He turned as his son, Adolin, approached, clad in golden sharplate that gleamed beneath the weak morning light. The armor lent him the presence of a seasoned warrior, though his youth still lingered in the set of his jaw, the fire in his gaze.
You didn't sleep?
Adolin observed, his tone more statement than question. Dalinar exhaled.
No.
The younger Colin studied him for a moment before stepping beside him at the railing.
The visions again?
Dalinar didn't answer right away. His eyes followed the distant chasms where their soldiers would soon march, where the Parshendi waited with their strange, rhythmic war chants. He had fought for years, had led Alethi warriors into countless battles, but the war had begun to feel different, as though he were pushing against a tide he did not fully understand.
I wonder,
he murmured,
if I am leading us toward ruin.
Adolin shifted uncomfortably, his plated gauntlets resting on the railing.
You've always done what's best for Alethkar.
Dalinar's expression darkened.
Perhaps, but I fear that what is best will not be enough.
The high storm struck that evening with a fury that rattled the very stones of the war camp. Dalinar knelt upon his balcony, bracing himself against the howling wind, his thoughts drowned in the roar of the storm. Then, as always, came the pull, the wrenching sensation that tore him from reality and flung him into the past. Light. A battlefield, bodies strewn across the rocky ground, their armor bearing symbols long since forgotten. Above them, figures stood in gleaming shardplate, their forms bathed in stormlight, their cloaks rippling in an unseen wind. The knights radiant. Dalinar tried to step forward, but the vision shifted. The landscape twisted, and he found himself in a vast open hall, pillars of stone stretching endlessly into darkness. And then, a voice, deep, commanding, ancient.
Unite them.
The words rang through him, reverberating in his very soul. He tried to speak, to ask, to demand answers, but the vision shattered around him, the storm outside roaring back into focus. He gasped, blinking against the lantern light of his tent. His skin was clammy, his heart pounding. Adolin was there, kneeling beside him, his hands gripping Dalinar's shoulders.
Father?
Dalinar forced a breath into his lungs. His limbs ached, his mind reeled, but he knew one thing with certainty.
We must speak with the king.
Elhokar Kholin sat in the grand war pavilion, his throne an elaborate construction of wood and gemstone, polished but lacking the grandeur of the true royal seat in Kholinar. He wore rings of gold and sapphire on his fingers, twisting one absently as his uncle stood before him. Dalinar kept his expression steady, his voice firm.
We cannot go on like this.
Elhokar arched a brow.
Like what, Uncle?
Dalinar gestured towards the entrance of the pavilion, where beyond the walls of the war camp, the plains stretched endlessly into conflict.
The High Princes play their war games, bickering over gem hearts, but Alethkar is crumbling. We need unity. We need strength.
The king leaned back in his chair.
And you would have me demand this unity?
Dalinar's jaw tightened.
Yes.
Elhokar's gaze flickered to the side, where Sadeas stood, arms crossed, his lips curled into a faint, knowing smile.
Your uncle means to say,
Sadeas said smoothly,
that we should abandon our individual war efforts and follow his lead. One army, one command.
Dalinar did not look at him.
If we do not stand together, we will fall.
Sadeas chuckled.
And who, I wonder, would be the one leading this grand alliance?
Dalinar turned his gaze to Elhokar.
The king, of course.
Silence stretched between them. The tension in the room thickened. Elhokar drummed his fingers against the armrest of his throne.
I will consider it, but I will not force the High Princes into anything.
Dalinar inclined his head stiffly.
Then I will convince them.
Sadeas smirked.
You're going to need more than words, Blackthorn.
The remnants of the storm clung to the keep the next morning, mist rising from rain-drenched stone. Dalinar stood once more upon his balcony, his eyes distant as he watched soldiers move below, their training shouts rising over the murmurs of the waking camp. Adolin stood beside him, his plated arms crossed.
You look worse than usual.
Dalinar exhaled, the wind tugging at his cloak.
The visions are changing.
Adolin frowned.
More of that talk about uniting Alethkar?
Dalinar's grip on the railing tightened.
Perhaps it is nonsense. Or perhaps it is the only truth that matters.
His son studied him for a long moment, skepticism clear in his eyes, but he said nothing. Dalinar turned back to the horizon, the distant chasm still glowing with the last remnants of Stormlight. He had once been a warlord, feared across Alethkar, the Blackthorn, an unstoppable force on the battlefield. But now he felt something else pressing upon him, heavier than any shard plate. A weight that no battlefield victory could ease. A kingdom stood on the edge of ruin, divided and broken. And somehow, he had to find a way to unite them before it was too late. Part 5. Oaths and Lies. The bridge felt impossibly heavy as Kaladin heaved it forward, every muscle burning, every breath ragged. The shattered plains stretched endlessly before him, jagged and cruel, offering no respite. Around him, the bridge crew surged forward, struggling under the crushing weight of the wooden construct that could mean either salvation or slaughter. The Parshendi's war chants echoed across the battlefield, a rhythmic pulse of alien song that sent a shiver down his spine. Then came the arrows. They sliced through the air in deadly arcs, their obsidian tips gleaming in the light. Men cried out as they fell, some collapsing instantly, others stumbling a few more desperate steps before the pain overwhelmed them. Kaladin clenched his teeth, willing his legs to move faster. The Parshendi weren't aiming for the bridge. They never did. They aimed for the men, striking exposed flesh, seeking out weakness. A choked scream erupted beside him. Kaladin turned just in time to see one of his crew stagger, an arrow buried deep in his thigh. The man gasped, his hands trembling as he grasped at the shaft protruding from his leg.
Keep running.
Kaladin's voice was hoarse, torn between urgency and fury. Some obeyed, driven by terror, while others hesitated, glancing back at their fallen comrades. But there was no time. The chasm loomed ahead, the drop a sheer, merciless void. With one final surge of effort, they reached the edge and let the bridge fall into place with a thunderous crash. Then came the charge. Enemy soldiers rushed forward, led by figures clad in shardplate, their steps unshaken by the chaos. It was another battle, another blood-soaked victory. Another day where too many men had died. Panting, Kaladin stood amidst the fallen, his gaze sweeping over faces he recognized, faces he had spoken to just that morning. The cost of survival weighed heavily upon him.
Storm it all,
he muttered under his breath. A soft blue light flickered beside him. Syl hovered near his shoulder, her form a whisper of movement in the air.
You're angry again,
she observed, her voice light but filled with quiet understanding. Kaladin exhaled sharply.
How could I not be? We're nothing to them. Less than soldiers. Less than men. Just tools to be used and discarded.
Syl tilted her head, her translucent wings shimmering faintly.
And what will you do?
The question gnawed at him. What could he do? He was a slave, a bridgeman, a man meant to die, but his fists clenched with defiance. They would not break him. That night, as the remnants of Bridge 4 sat in exhausted silence, Kaladin stood before them. His body ached, but his voice was steady.
This needs to change.
Teft, his face lined with age and battle-worn wisdom, regarded him with a skeptical gaze.
And how do you propose we do that, Storm Blessed?
Kaladin met his stare without flinching.
We train. We grow stronger. We survive.
A quiet ripple of uncertainty passed through the group. Then Rock, the Horn-Eater cook, let out a low chuckle.
Train. Train for what?
To fight back.
Murmurs followed, some hesitant, others bitter. Moash, his eyes shadowed with something darker than exhaustion, crossed his arms.
And if we refuse?
Kaladin didn't waver.
Then you'll die.
The silence that followed was heavier than the bridge had been, but one by one the men nodded. They understood the truth of it. Elhokar Kolin sat upon his throne, his fingers tracing absent patterns over the gemstone embedded in his signet ring. The room felt too large, the shadows too deep. His eyes, sharp with suspicion, flickered between the two men standing before him, Dalinar and Sadeas.
Someone is trying to kill me,
he declared. Dalinar barely held back a sigh.
Your Majesty, there is no evidence.
The girth strap on my saddle was cut.
Elhokar snapped, his voice edged with frustration.
I nearly fell during last week's hunt.
Dalinar exchanged a glance with Sadeas, who remained impassive.
Storms wear leather, Your Majesty. Not every mishap is an assassination attempt.
Elhokar's jaw tightened.
You think I'm imagining it? There are enemies in every shadow, Uncle. You should understand.
Dalinar did understand, but Elhokar was not his father. Gavilar had ruled through strength, through vision. Elhokar ruled through fear.
I will have my men investigate,
Dalinar said at last.
But paranoia will not keep you safe.
Elhokar's gaze remained wary, but then Sadeas finally spoke, his voice smooth as ever.
Perhaps an official inquiry, Your Majesty. A public display of your authority.
The king's eyes brightened.
Yes, a demonstration. They must see that I am watching.
Dalinar clenched his fists. The seeds of fear had been planted, and Sadeas had ensured they would take root.
Very well,
Elhokar declared.
We will get to the bottom of this.
Dalinar bowed, though his thoughts lingered elsewhere. A king who ruled by fear would never unite Alethkar. Later, standing atop the cliffs of the war camp, he watched as soldiers trained below, the ring of steel on steel filling the crisp morning air. Beside him, Adlan spoke, his tone measured.
Elhokar's paranoia grows worse.
Dalinar nodded.
And Sadeas feeds it.
His son studied him.
What will you do?
Dalinar closed his eyes, the weight of his shard plate, real or imagined, settling over his shoulders.
What must be done?
The war was not only with the Parshendi, it raged within Alethkar itself, and he would not let it tear them apart. Shallan's fingers trembled as they traced the smooth surface of the gemstone in her palm. Its inner light pulsed, shifting unnaturally, alive in a way that defied explanation. Her heartbeat quickened. Nearby, Yasna Kolin stood with arms folded.
What do you see?
Shallan hesitated.
Something inside it.
Yasna studied her with sharp, assessing eyes.
Good. You're beginning to understand.
Then, without another word, the princess turned and placed her hand against a massive boulder. It vanished. Not shattered, not displaced, simply gone. A wisp of smoke curled where the stone had been, as if the rock had been unmade. Shallan inhaled sharply.
That's impossible.
Yasna met her gaze without a hint of amusement.
It is merely a facet of science you do not yet comprehend.
Shallan tightened her grip on the gemstone, her mind reeling. She had come here seeking knowledge, but this was power. Power to change, to reshape the world, power to save her family. Part 6. Truths in the Dark. The quiet corridors of Yasna Kolian's private quarters were lined with towering bookshelves reaching from floor to ceiling. In the stillness, Shallan Davar stood before her mentor, her sketchbook open and charcoal smudges still marking her fingertips. Yasna examined the intricate drawing Shallan had made, a precise rendering of the goblet resting on the table before them.
You view things in a unique way.
Yasna observed softly.
That is promising. It's the first step toward truly knowing them.
Swallowing hard, Shallan replied.
You mentioned that understanding is key to soul casting.
Yasna corrected her gently.
It takes will first, though understanding certainly aids it.
Fastened to Yasna's wrist, the powerful soulcaster, a fabrial of great might, had already dazzled Shallan on previous occasions, transforming rock into smoke and objects at her whim. With a measured gesture, Yasna raised her hand, letting her fingers gently graze the goblet's surface. Almost immediately, a chill filled the room. The goblet began to tremble and, in the blink of an eye, vanished. In its place, now, lay a small mound of crystal. Shallan's breath hitched as she beheld the change. Though she had witnessed transformations before, this one still challenged everything she thought she knew.
Now it's your turn,
Yasna prompted, motioning towards another goblet. Hesitance flickered across Shallan's face. She had no fabrial to aid her, no gemstone to channel the energy. Yet, a quiet voice within urged her onward. Slowly she reached out, her fingers brushing the smooth surface of the goblet, and closed her eyes. In that moment, her surroundings shifted entirely. No longer standing in Yasna's chambers, she found herself in a vast, dark realm, where shifting lights intermingled with boundless blackness. Shadesmar. Around her feet, small beads rolled and murmured as if possessed by life itself. The goblet appeared there too, not as a mere object, but as an idea imbued with its own presence. Change, thought Shallan, become something else. The goblet resisted her command at first. Undeterred, she pushed harder. Suddenly, reality snapped back. The goblet had disappeared, replaced by a blood-red crystal. Shallan gasped and staggered back, meeting Yasna's inscrutable gaze.
You performed that without a fabrial,
Yasna stated quietly. Looking down at her trembling hands, Shallan wondered what she had just done. Far away, the winds carried the scent of sweat, mud, and blood. The persistent roar of distant battles echoed across the plateaus of the shattered plains, a land where war was endless, though its warriors were not. Kaladin Stormbless moved through Bridge 4's makeshift camp with deliberate, measured steps. The bridgemen clustered in small groups, sharing their meager rations or tending to fresh injuries. Each man had long since learned not to hope or expect to survive, but that mindset had to change. Kaladin paused beside Rock, the large horneator, who, miraculously, still found reasons to smile amidst the suffering.
Eat quickly,
Kaladin urged.
We train at sunset.
Rock lifted his gaze from a bowl of thin, watery stew and quirked a thick eyebrow.
Train?
Do you really think running bridges is all we're capable of?
Kaladin retorted.
If we want to survive, we need to become stronger and smarter. We can't simply continue running toward our doom.
Around the campfire, eyes met with a mix of skepticism and weariness. Teft, an older bridgeman with a soldier's bearing, snorted dismissively.
Survive?
You believe we have a choice? We're just bridge crews, storm-blessed. We don't fight or even have armor.
We fight when we must.
Kaladin insisted.
And we must fight for one another.
A weighted silence fell over them, a dangerous sentiment, as hope was not welcome among the bridge crews. The air hung heavy with the scent of rain, mingled with stone. Kaladin soon found himself standing at the rim of a deep chasm. He peered down into its shadowy depths. The bridgemen had been dispatched on chasm duty to salvage what they could from the battlefield and sift through the remnants of the fallen. It was treacherous work. Should a high storm strike, there would be no escape. Descending the rocky slope with his men, their lanterns casting elongated shadows on the stone, Kaladin took in the grim sight. Soldiers lay scattered across the chasm floor, their armor shattered and weapons lost in the chaos. Kaladin moved among the bodies, collecting usable spears and stripping leather from the dead, aware that every resource was precious. Beside him, Syl, the tiny windspren, glowed faintly as it flitted about.
This place feels wrong,
it whispered. Kaladin nodded, recognizing an unsettling aura that went beyond the constant presence of death within the chasm. Tef joined him, holding a salvaged spear.
Storms. This work never gets any easier.
Kaladin examined the spear's weight before responding.
We need every advantage. If we're going to endure, we must be armed.
Teft frowned, questioning.
Do you truly believe we can fight back?
Kaladin looked over his weary crew, exhausted and worn, but not beyond saving.
We have to try,
he insisted. At that moment, a deep rumble echoed through the chasm. Kaladin felt a knot in his stomach.
Take cover,
he ordered. The high storm came suddenly, and with the fury of the Almighty, thundering through the chasms with a power that seemed to shake the earth itself. Wind, rain, and debris rushed down the narrow gorge, pounding the rocky walls and filling the air with a deafening roar. In a frantic rush, the bridgemen scrambled as their lanterns swung erratically. The chasm walls quaked, while the cacophony of wind and water grew rapidly more intense. Kaladin seized Rock and pushed him forward. In moments, the turbulent wall of water and wind crashed over them. Kaladin just managed to grab hold of a protruding boulder as the storm's force enveloped him. He clung on with every bit of strength as booming words filled his mind.
Life before death, strength before weakness, journey before destination.
The storm raged on, shaking the chasm to its foundation. Kaladin felt something profound within him, an energy unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The world fractured, and he was no longer just a man standing in the storm. He saw something vast, a presence woven into the very heart of the tempest. A figure loomed in the darkness, shifting between light and shadow. A being of immense power, one that watched him.
Child of Tanavast.
The words resonated through him, deeper than sound, as if spoken directly into his soul. The storm was no longer just wind and water. It had purpose. It was alive. The power of it pressed against his skin, into his skin, as if it could fill him, make him more than he was. And for a single terrifying moment, he felt it. Stormlight pulsing inside him, raw and unshaped. The shatter plains lay below, drenched in rain. Dalinar Kholin stood atop his fortress, surveying the devastation that had been left in its wake. His mystical visions had returned, visions of ancient warriors and cryptic words he could scarcely understand.
Unite them.
The command echoed in his mind, like the dying thunder. Adolin lingered by his side, arms folded as he watched his father closely.
You need to stop this,
Adolin insisted.
People are talking, and they're starting to think you're losing your grip.
Maybe I am,
Dalinar admitted softly. Adolin exhaled heavily.
No, you're not. But if you continue talking about honor, unity, the Radiance and the Almighty's will, you'll alienate the little support you have left.
Closing his eyes, Dalinar felt the exhaustion overwhelm him. So very weary, he questioned whether he could trust what he was seeing. Were these visions messages, or merely delusions? And if they were real, why had the Almighty chosen him? Part 7. The Price of Freedom. When the winds finally subsided, the rain eased, and the booming echoes of thunder faded, Kaladin awoke, finding himself alive. Miraculously, the others were too. Exhausted and battered, they had managed to pull themselves from the deep cracks and crevices of the chasm floor, each one checking for injuries. A few had bruises, others bore cuts from flying debris, but not a single life was lost. A miracle by itself. The supplies they had gathered were no more, ripped away by the storm's ferocity. To make it back to camp, they would have to climb. Kaladin had led them through the chasms, finding the narrowest, most stable walls of rock to scale. One by one, they hauled themselves upward, fingers scraping for grip while their muscles screamed from exertion. Hours later, they emerged onto the plateaus once more, blinking against the burgeoning light of morning. The trek back to camp was silent, aside from the crunch of boots against stone. When the men of Bridge 4 finally reached the barracks, they were utterly exhausted, drenched and starving, but alive. And that was more than most bridgemen could say. Kaladin leaned against the cold stone wall, the damp chill seeping through his tattered shirt. The shelter for Bridge 4 was little more than a crude enclosure, barely enough to shield them from the worst of the elements. It wasn't designed for men. It was meant for the discarded and forgotten. Yet for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was a hint of something other than despair in the air. Kaladin glanced over at the group of men gathered near the dim glow of an oil lantern. Rock was carefully dishing out a thin stew, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he handed out bowls. Teft sat nearby, his sharp eyes watching the others with the cautious wariness of a veteran soldier who'd seen too much. Moshe, still bitter, though no longer silent, leaned against a post, listening intently. Even Dunny, the quietest among them, let out an occasional chuckle. Fragile though it was, this camaraderie felt real. Taking a slow breath, Kaladin reflected. They could be more than this. Looking at his rough, scarred hands, he remembered how they'd been told that bridgemen were nothing more than expendable bodies meant to die. He was determined to prove them wrong. The first time he urged them to train, they had laughed.
Train?
Moish had scoffed, arms crossed.
What, are we expected to fight the Parshendi with empty hands?
Rock had chuckled, adding,
Maybe we should practice running in circles. We're already very good at that.
Kaladin had simply replied,
We're weak. The war camps see us as nothing, but we are still men. We can be more than just targets for arrows.
Teft had grumbled,
We don't have weapons, armor, or support. What exactly do you want us to do?
Then, Kaladin had stepped forward, gripping a long pole salvaged from a broken spear shaft in the chasms, and spun it in his hands, the motions returning like muscle memory.
We start here,
he said. The first day brought grumbling. Kaladin's orders were met with resistance, their bodies sluggish from exhaustion, and their minds dulled by years of suffering. They had known only death and despair, the weight of bridgeman life pressing down upon them, like the very bridges they carried. When he ordered them to run, they cursed under their breath. When he made them lift stones, their eyes burned with suspicion. Why train? Why build strength when death was inevitable? But Kaladin had seen what they could become, and he was not about to let them rot in their own hopelessness. The second day saw tentative attempts. Some hesitated, but others, Moshe, Teft, even Rock, began to move with something resembling purpose. Their bodies protested with aches and pains, yet the drills continued. Kaladin pushed them through morning runs, muscle-burning lifts, and grueling repetitions. He saw the way their eyes flickered with something new. Curiosity, perhaps? Hope? It was faint, but it was there. Bridge 4 was not yet an army, but something was changing. By the third day, they were listening. No longer did they bicker, no longer did they drag their feet through the dirt. Their steps grew steadier, their grips firmer. The Bridge 4 barrack, once a place of defeated men waiting to die, pulsed with something unfamiliar. Discipline. A purpose that stretched beyond mere survival. Teft asked questions about tactics. Rock, though still refusing to fight, watched the others spar with interest. Even Moash, one arm ever ready with a quip, threw himself into training with unexpected enthusiasm. And Kaladin saw it, saw the fire beginning to stir in them. They were not yet warriors, but they were no longer slaves to despair. They were becoming something more, something dangerous. Dalinar Kholin strode through the war camp, the familiar weight of his shard plate, a constant presence against his body. The noon sun bounced off the metal, scattering bright, sharp reflections across the stone pathways as he passed by disciplined soldiers in blue and gold uniforms, the unmistakable mark of Kholin men. One might expect pride, yet an uneasy feeling gnawed at him. Sadeas, the man was officially his ally, a comrade in arms who had fought beside him for years. Still, Dalinar's instincts whispered warnings. He had noticed subtle shifts in strategy, the way Sadeas maneuvered his forces into battles that gained him prestige while costing him little, and his careful positioning near El-Hokar, always whispering suspicions into the young king's ear. Dalinar was not one to be overly paranoid. He'd fought too many battles and seen too much to mistake mere shadows for threats, yet this time felt different. Approaching the king's chamber, he received crisp salutes from the guards stationed outside and nodded before stepping through the grand wooden doors. The room was dimly lit by infused spheres mounted along the walls, their soft light mixing with the faint smell of ink and oil. El-Hokar sat, hunched over his desk, nervously fidgeting with a golden ring, his expression drawn and lips pressed into a thin line of frustration. Dalinar examined him closely.
See? They are trying to kill me, Uncle.
El-Hokar muttered, his voice tight with barely contained anxiety. Dalinar stiffened.
What are you talking about?
He asked as he stepped closer. El-Hokar abruptly rose and began pacing in short, agitated strides.
The saddle strap,
he said, ruffling his short, dark hair.
It was cut. I nearly died on the field.
For a moment, Dalinar fell silent, processing the implication. He had heard of the incident, a clean cut in the leather that was suspicious, though not definitively incriminating. Was this an assassination attempt, or just more paranoia? El-Hokar had always been quick to see threats lurking in every corner, unlike his father Gavilar, whose steady confidence commanded respect. The mantle of kingship had never sat comfortably on El-Hokar, yet that didn't necessarily make him wrong. Dalinar folded his arms.
I will investigate,
he said carefully.
But do not let fear cloud your judgment.
El-Hokar's scowl deepened.
You always treat me like a child.
You are king,
Dalinar replied firmly.
And that means acting with wisdom, not out of fear.
El-Hokar clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as if to argue, yet no words followed. Dalinar exhaled, his shoulders heavy beneath the weight of his armor. Gavilar's death still haunted them all. The late king had been a pillar of strength, the foundation upon which Alethkar was built. Now, with high princes jostling for power and enemies waiting in the shadows, something ominous was coming. Dalinar could feel it deep in his bones, and he would not let Alethkar fall. Far from the shattered plains, in the grand halls of Kharbranth, Shallan Devar sat before a blank sheet of paper, charcoal in hand. The library was quiet, filled with the lingering scent of parchment and old ink, while orderly stacks of books towered around her. Soft light from infused spheres flickered over the polished wooden table where she worked. Allowing her thoughts to drift in the way she often did, Shallan let memories rise and fall like waves on a vast ocean. The sounds of the city, muffled behind stone walls, seemed distant and unimportant. Here, surrounded by knowledge, she felt safe, or at least she wanted to feel that way. Then she began to draw. Her fingers moved in quick, decisive strokes as she first outlined a face, sharp cheekbones, a regal brow, and lips set in a firm line of contemplation. On the page, Yasna Kholin emerged in charcoal and shadow, each stroke capturing an intensity that words could never fully express. Her breathing slowed to a steady rhythm as her hand moved almost instinctively, rendering intricate details, the precise styling of Yasna's hair, the way a stray lock would fall imperfectly, yet beautifully. Each deliberate line added depth, even if she hadn't consciously planned every detail. She furrowed her brow slightly and added another stroke. Soon, the image of a hallway she'd seen only once appeared. Marble columns lining the passage, the subtly textured stone floor worn smooth by years of footsteps, and even the slight tilt of a lantern sconce captured with unnerving precision, details she had never consciously noted before. Only when she finally stepped back did she realize what she had done. Her sketches were flawless, more than flawless. Her pulse quickened as she stared at the page. She'd rendered details that she hadn't even been aware of, as if her hand had recorded them like a camera, preserving every nuance with unnatural precision. Flipping to a blank page, she tested her charcoal once more. Closing her eyes, she summoned the memory of a scene she'd barely registered, a glimpse of Yasna's study from the doorway. Allowing the image to unfold in her mind, her fingers moved to finish the final strokes of a book's spine on a shelf, each line positioned with perfect accuracy beside its neighbors. She swallowed hard. This was more than talent. It was something else entirely. A shiver ran down her spine as she closed her sketchbook carefully, her fingers tightening around its worn leather cover. Her art had always been her greatest strength, her one true advantage in a world demanding she play the part of the perfect noblewoman. But now, for the first time, she wondered what was happening to her. Was her skill merely the result of practice and keen observation, or was it something beyond that? For the first time, she feared it might be something more. Part 8. Shadows and Betrayals. The library in Kharbranth exuded the aroma of ancient parchment and dust, its air heavy with hints of ink and lingering candle smoke. It was a sanctuary of learning, a place where history murmured from carefully arranged volumes, and where seekers of wisdom lost themselves amid endless corridors. Shallan sat at a carved wooden table, her fingers resting lightly on a book whose worn pages she no longer truly read. The elegant script blurred before her eyes, its words reduced to meaningless shapes on faded parchment. Her thoughts wandered far away. She could almost hear her father's voice, its cold authority pressing down on her like the weight of a mountain. Even here, across the continent, his shadow clung to her. The Dava family was sinking, overwhelmed not only by debt, but by secrets too dark to name.
You are our only hope, Shallan.
She closed her eyes, momentarily pushing down the rush of nausea that the memory stirred. She had come to Kharbranth for a purpose she clung to like a lifeline, to steal Yasna Kholin's soulcaster, to return home, and to save her brothers. But now, everything felt different. Yasna was not the woman Shallan had anticipated. Brilliant, calculating and ruthless in her pursuit of knowledge, Yasna's mentorship bore no trace of warmth or leniency. Shallan had believed she could maneuver the scholar princess to her advantage, yet Yasna was far beyond such manipulation. She saw through deceit as if it were transparent. And still, Yasna had chosen her. Not out of kindness, Yasna Kholin was not in the habit of kindness, but out of a devotion to truth. And the truth was that Shallan had changed. She had soulcast without a fabrial, touched something beyond her understanding, Shadesmar, a realm of shifting lights and endless dark waters, and spoken with beings that should not exist. She'd have returned altered.
What am I becoming?
She wondered. A sudden flicker of movement yanked her from her reverie. Her eyes snapped up, and she stiffened as a man appeared in the library's archway. His finely tailored robes clung to his lean frame, his posture unnervingly precise, his presence deliberate as he watched her intently. Instantly, she knew he was out of place. He was not a scholar, nor a servant of the palace. As quickly as he had appeared, the man vanished without a trace. A chill ran down her spine. She had encountered men like him before, lurking within the halls of her father's estate, watching and waiting. Clenching her fingers into fists beneath the table, she kept her breathing even. The ghost bloods had found her. Her family's secrets were no longer hers alone. Outside, rain dripped steadily from the eaves of the war camp barracks, beating a constant rhythm against the wooden roof. Each droplet splashed into muddy pools outside, rippling outward before being swallowed by the next. The air smelled of damp wood, sweat, and the ever-present tang of blood and steel that hung over the shattered plains. Inside, Kaladin sat with his back pressed against a rough wooden support beam, arms resting on his knees. The cold seeped into his bones, yet he barely noticed as his eyes followed the tiny rivulets of water, carving snaking trails through the dirt. A slow, aimless journey, mirroring the unraveling of his own life. Across from him, Tef sat holding a dented tin cup filled with lukewarm broth. After a slow sip, he remarked in a casual tone, though his gaze remained sharp.
You never talk about how you ended up here.
Kaladin said nothing. Tef leaned back, stretching his legs out before him with a quiet sigh.
We all have our stories. You're not the only one who's lost everything.
Kaladin's fingers curled into fists as old pain stirred inside him, bumping against the walls he had built over time.
I killed him,
he murmured, his voice barely rising above a whisper. Tef frowned and lowered his cup.
Who?
Kaladin stared at the floor, his pulse thundering in his ears.
Tien, my brother. I was supposed to protect him. I promised I would.
The words felt heavy, rough in his throat.
And I failed.
A thick silence fell between them, laden with the ghosts of the past. Kaladin had not spoken of Tien in ages. He had buried that grief beneath layers of anger and duty, yet it had never left him, an ever-present reminder of countless failures. He could still see Tien's face, young, innocent, smiling, even amid chaos. Tien had believed in the wonder of the world, even when death circled close, and Kaladin had let him die. Tef studied him for a long moment before nodding, his expression unreadable.
We've all lost someone.
Kaladin closed his eyes, but within that darkness still burned a purpose, a chance to protect those around him, to do what he had failed to do before. Bridge 4. They might not be soldiers in the traditional sense, or even free men, but they were his, and this time he would not fail. In the gloom of a palace corridor, Seth Sonson Balano knelt in shadow, his shard blade resting in his hands, with a surface as smooth as mist. The dim glow of infused spheres lit the hallway in shifting pale light, casting long, twisting shadows along the stone walls. He did not tremble. He did not hesitate, for he was truthless, and that was the only truth that mattered. His master's orders were clear. Another name, another death. Without question or reservation, his purpose was to obey. Tonight, the king of Jar Keved would die. Moving like a whisper on the wind, Seth advanced silently, his feet barely disturbing the polished stone beneath him. Guards stood watch at opposite ends of the corridor, their halberds gleaming, their stances relaxed, unaware that death was already among them. He passed them effortlessly, gliding between patches of shadow and keeping close to the walls as if he belonged to them.
They do not see me. They never see me,
he thought. Ahead, the ornate door to the king's chamber loomed, thick, elaborately carved with glyphs of authority and protection, designed to withstand intruders and keep assassins at bay. But it would not bar his way. Seth did not knock. Instead, he pressed his fingers against the wood and pushed with Stormlight. The door opened silently, without creaking, as still as a grave. Inside, the room was bathed in dim candlelight, the air perfumed with the scent of ink and old paper. A massive desk dominated the center, cluttered with scattered documents, open ledgers, and a half-filled inkwell. Behind the desk sat the king of Jar Kavad. He was not adorned in armor or the customary regal finery. Instead, he wore a simple silk robe of deep crimson, embroidered with golden glyphs of kingship. Looking up at Sheth, his expression was weary, and his eyes conveyed a profound understanding.
You've come then,
the king murmured. Seth hesitated, surprised by the unexpected acknowledgement. The king sighed, deliberately setting his pen aside.
I knew it would be you.
Seth tightened his grip on his shard blade.
You knew this was coming?
Yes,
the king replied simply. A heavy silence stretched between them, as oppressive as the oncoming storm. Sheth had ended the lives of dozens, witnessed their final moments of terror and regret. Some had pleaded, some had screamed, and others had fought desperately against their fate. But this moment felt different. The king did not resist, did not beg for mercy. He only closed his eyes slowly. Seth obeyed. His shard blade swept silently through flesh and bone, with no resistance or cry. King of Jar Keved died without a sound. Part 9. Visions and Shadows. Dalinar Kholin stood at the boundary of his war camp, where the scent of damp stone hung heavily in the air. The high storm's fury had finally subsided, leaving behind puddles that mirrored the brooding sky above. His thoughts were in turmoil. The visions had returned, more forceful than before. As always, they arrived unbidden, merciless in their intensity. One moment he had been inside his tent, poring over battle strategies with Adlin, and the next he found himself in an impossibly unreal realm. Before him lay a battlefield of endless golden fields under a sun that blazed too fiercely, its light unnaturally bright. There, arrayed in radiant, gleaming armor and armed with weapons that vibrated with stormlight, were the knights, Radiant. Although he had seen their faces in previous visions, he had never encountered them like this. They were engaged in silent discourse, their words indecipherable, until one figure stepped forward, a tall, dignified woman whose face remained concealed behind the luminous visor of her helm. As she moved, her cloak billowed behind her without a breeze, and when she finally spoke, her words resonated clearly.
Unite them.
Dalinar inhaled sharply as the vision shattered, leaving him drenched in sweat. The command reverberated in his mind. Unite them. His heart pounded as he grasped the enormity of what he heard. Clutching the balcony's railing, he felt the weight of destiny pressing upon him. Alethkar was splintered. The High Princes fought each other not for honor, but for power. Meanwhile, Elokar's weakness, and Sardius's lurking ambition compounded the chaos. Dalinar had tried patience and persuasion, but he now knew that only unity would secure victory. Leaving the balcony with resolute steps, he returned to his chambers, where Adelin's concerned eyes met his.
Father?
His son asked. Dalinar's response was firm.
I know what I must do.
This time, there would be no hesitation. Meanwhile, Kaladin sat with Bridge 4, his gaze fixed on the meagre fire they had kindled in a pilfered brazier. The fire's weak orange glow barely pushed back the deep shadows clinging to the barracks. The embers pulsed, sending twisting ribbons of heat into the frigid air. Yet they offered little protection against the biting wind seeping through the wooden walls. The men were clustered together, huddled against the cold, but Kaladin sensed that it wasn't just the chill that held them close. It was an unspoken understanding. They lingered, their eyes flickering to him before darting away. They were waiting, expecting something from him. Kaladin exhaled slowly, burdened by the silent demand of their hope. Having been with them long enough to understand, he knew they had accepted him in their own way, though acceptance was not the same as trust, a treasure that must be earned. Tonight, for the first time, he decided it was time to ask.
Teft.
He broke the silence.
How did you end up here?
Teft's broad shoulders stiffened as he adjusted the tin cup in his hands. His weak broth, more water than sustenance, sloshed as he gazed into it, watching ripples settle before he replied in a low, gravelly tone.
I was a soldier.
His words were muted, heavy with a deeper sorrow. Kaladin frowned.
You never said.
Teft's response was clipped.
No reason to. We were dead men anyway.
He shifted his stance and cast a glance around at the others before returning his focus to the fire. In its flickering light, the creases on his weathered face deepened, making him appear older than he was.
Not much to tell, really. I got myself into trouble, chose the wrong side in a fight, and now I'm here.
Rock, the burly horn-eater, let out a low chuckle that rumbled like distant thunder.
He makes it sound so simple, as if he isn't still carrying that burden in his soul.
Teft scowled, tightening his grip on the cup.
Want to share your story, Horn-Eater?
Rock merely shrugged with deliberate ease.
I used to be a cook.
The others chuckled at the simplicity of his words, though beneath the humor was an undercurrent of shared pain. Each of them harbored a troubled past, haunted by personal ghosts. Letting the silence fall again, Kaladin felt the weight of their collective suffering, a heaviness akin to the calm before a storm. He looked at the men around him, those who had survived the chasms, endured relentless bridge runs, and gradually learned to depend on one another. They had been told they were worthless, expendable, already dead. Yet he now saw in them a spark of resilience, visible in the way they sat together, listened intently, and continued to fight, even if only for the break of another day.
We're not bridgemen anymore,
he said softly.
Not in the way they intend us to be.
The others met his gaze with wary uncertainty.
We've become something different, something stronger, something unbreakable.
Far across the continent, in the quiet confines of Yasna Kolin's quarters, a solitary candle flickered against smooth stone walls. The mingled aroma of ink and fresh parchment, with hints of salt from the distant Carbranthean sea, filled the air through open balcony doors. Shalan Davar sat stiffly at her desk, her hands trembling as they rested on the worn surface of her sketchbook. The past few days had unsettled her, shaking the very foundation of her reality. She had soulcast without the aid of a fabrial, an impossibility by all accounts. According to Yasna, soulcasting required a special device, a soulcaster imbued with gemstones to harness Stormlight. Yet Shallan had managed it using only her own will, a terrifying, instinctive plunge into a realm of shifting light and endless darkness. Shadesmar. She had kept this feat hidden from Yasna, at least for now, sinking instead into her studies as she tried to decipher the mysterious symbols that had appeared in that other world. But something else stirred within her, lurking just beneath her awareness. A feeling of being watched, of a presence waiting patiently. And tonight, that calling grew louder. Taking up her charcoal, her hand moved almost on its own, sketching curving lines and jagged shapes that emerged from the depths of her memory. A bead of sweat formed on her brow as the realization dawned. She was drawing a doorway, a portal that existed beyond the bounds of reality, yet had appeared in that vast ocean of darkness and whispers. The symbols around it pulsed on the page, and suddenly the world shifted. Her desk, the scattered books, the lone candle, all disappeared. She was falling. Shallan hit what should have been the ground, but instead found herself submerged in an endless black sea, not of water, but of glass. It did not ripple under her weight, nor did it soak her clothes. It simply lay there, reflecting the eerie, distant lights that pulsed high in the sky. A realm of infinite obsidian stretched before her. She gasped, her breath fogging the air, even though the cold did not truly touch her skin. All around, countless tiny beads moved with faint murmurs. This was real. Desperately, she turned, seeking anything familiar amidst the boundless dark. When she saw them, figures in the distance, watching, shadows taking the vague shapes of people, barely noticeable against the vast void. Her throat tightened as she whispered,
Where am I?
At that moment, as the beads shifted at her feet, a single word resonated in the silence.
Shadesmar.
Part 10. The Cognitive Realm. The latest in the most recent series of high storms had moved on, yet their remnants lingered, a presence settling over the war camp like the weight of unseen eyes. Water trickled from the eaves of the barracks, pooling in the uneven ground between the rows of tents. The aroma of wet stone and storm-washed metal fused with the distant scent of burning cook fires. Even the world seemed burdened after the storm, as if the sky itself had not yet recovered from its unleashed fury. Kaladin sat by the entrance of Bridgefor's shelter, his fingers idly rolling over the rough surface of his calloused palm. His muscles throbbed, not from physical exertion, but from something deeper, something intrinsic. A tension pulsed in his chest, soft and persistent, like the heartbeat of an invisible force. Something was shifting within him. Since that high storm, the night in the Shasam, since he had faced the raging tempest and witnessed something vast and timeless, he had sensed it. A quiet hum resonated through his bones. A pressure simmered beneath his skin, waiting to be released. It moved with him, like unseen currents beneath the still surface of an unknown deep sea. He had tried to ignore it, but it was inescapable, sparking through his veins like the lingering energy of lightning after a storm. He had experienced change before. He'd felt it on the battlefields of Sadeas's war camps, when a spear's weight first felt natural in his grip. He remembered the lesson when his father pressed a scalpel into his hands, teaching him the fragility of life. He recalled the transformation when Tien had died. But this was entirely different. Syl flitted near him, a delicate shimmer in the cool morning air, her form sharper and more defined than before. There was something in her stance, an air of observance. She hovered just above his shoulder, moving in slow, deliberate patterns, as if choosing her words carefully before speaking.
You feel it, don't you?
She asked. Kaladin exhaled, observing his breath curl into the morning air.
I don't know what it is,
he confessed.
You do.
Seal murmured softly.
You're just scared to name it.
He clenched his fists, desperately trying to dismiss the strange sensation. It seemed absurd, impossible, and yet he had witnessed inexplicable things, had felt a power coursing through him that defied reason. He was changing. He felt the light within. The morning drills began as usual. The bridgemen lined up in the cold, makeshift spears gripped tightly in rough hands, their faces marked by caution and determination. Kaladin navigated among them, adjusting stances, correcting grips, reminding them that they could be more than mere labourers. Bridge 4 had transformed. They still ran and carried their burdens, but a new presence had settled upon them, a quiet strength, a renewed sense of purpose. They were no longer just slaves, no longer men resigned to dying. They were learning. Tef stood off to the side, arms crossed, observing intently. His gaze was sharp and appraising. When Kaladin passed, he called out,
You've changed since that storm.
Kaladin stiffened.
Have I?
He replied. Tef's face remained unmoved.
You move differently, as if something is driving you forward.
He paused, then added,
I know what you are, boy. I've seen men like you before.
Kaladin frowned.
What are you talking about?
Tef studied him for a long moment before shaking his head.
You don't see it yet, but you will.
Kaladin said nothing, unwilling to entertain what Teft might have implied. Instead, he turned toward the training dummies, his grip tightening on his spear as he focused on its familiar weight, a weapon he could understand. The world seemed to shift around him as his body surged forward faster than it should have. His feet scarcely met the ground, caught by the wind that lifted them. For a brief moment, he experienced a perfect, weightless motion, as if everything within him was aligning. His spear collided with their wooden dummy with a force he hadn't anticipated. The sharp crack echoed across the morning, definitive and uncompromising. The men halted, silence stretched out. Kaladin staggered back, his heart pounding wildly. He felt that surge again, an undeniable rush, power crackling in his limbs like the final vestiges of a storm. Seal still hovered near his shoulder, her tiny, radiant form unreadable.
You're starting to remember,
she whispered. Kaladin swallowed hard. He wasn't sure he wanted to. Across another realm, Shallan's breath came in short gasps as the word echoed through the vast emptiness around her. Shadesmar. The name alone sent a shiver through her, as though it held a meaning too vast to grasp fully. She knelt and let her fingers trail through the tiny beads that gathered around her feet. They tinkled softly, their surfaces cool and impossibly smooth, shifting subtly with every movement. They weren't sand, nor were they water, something in between. And each bead, she realized, seemed to whisper. Their voices were faint, like echoes in a deep cavern. Yet she could almost discern them, forming words.
A cup, a chair, a table.
She picked one up, and suddenly it wasn't merely an object in her hand. It was revealing itself. It understood what it was. A goblet, finely crafted in silver to hold wine, resting atop a polished wooden tray in the physical realm. The bead pulsed in her palm, as if waiting expectantly. She dropped it with a strangled gasp, the realization crashing over her like a tidal wave. These beads weren't just objects, they were the cognitive forms of items in the physical realm. Everything that existed there had a counterpart here, its essence captured in a simple, whispering sphere. Her heart pounded as she pushed herself upright, aware that the distant figures she had glimpsed earlier were now drawing nearer, though still indistinct. They did not move as normal people would. Instead, they seemed to approach by the mere malleability of distance. A heavy, unsettling feeling settled over her chest, a deep awareness that she did not belong here. Then, movement. The beads around her began to shift and swirl, as if stirred by something hidden beneath. A low murmur rose in the air from the figures beyond, not from the beads this time. Something was coming. Shallan whirled around, desperate for an escape, but how could she flee when she had no idea how she arrived? The pulsing lights overhead, were they distant stars or something else entirely? Provided no guidance. The encroaching shadows remained silent. The murmurs grew louder. The beads trembled. And then, hands. Black clawed fingers surged up from the sea of beads, reaching desperately for her. Shallan screamed and stumbled back as the figures in the void finally responded. They did not rush to her aid. They merely observed. The hands latched onto her clothing, her arms, her legs, pulling, dragging. Their grip was overwhelming, suffocating. They wanted something. Needed something.
Storm, Father, what are they?
She fought against them, kicking and gasping, but the beads refused to give way like water. Instead, they engulfed her. A deep, resonant voice rippled through the space.
Connection severed, flesh bound, return. Not yet. Not yet.
Abruptly, the hands released their hold. Shallan lurched forward and fell, not onto the shifting beads, but onto hard, smooth stone. The palace, her desk. The candle still burned, though the wax had melted further down. She was back. Gasping, she scrambled away from her chair, pressing a trembling hand to her chest as her heart pounded and sweat dampened her skin. It had been real. She glanced at the page before her. The sketch of the doorway remained, the symbols continuing to glow faintly. Something in the darkness had seen her. Something had let her go. But next time, would it? Part 11. The Awakening Storm. Dalinar Kholin turned from the watchtower, the echo of "Unite them" still a whisper in his mind. He could not afford another morning lost in brooding. The kingdom needed action, not reflection. The High Princes were fractured, each treating the war against the Parshendi as a competition rather than a duty. If he was to unite them, he needed to start somewhere. Steeling himself, he strode through the war camp with purpose. Soldiers paused to salute, their respect evident even in their weariness. He had led them through too many battles for anything less. Yet respect was not unity. It was not enough. He found himself at the edge of the training grounds, where his soldiers drilled under the watchful eyes of captains and ardents. Here, strength was honed, but it was also where grudges festered. The High Princes maintained their own separate forces, and their soldiers, though all Alethi, viewed each other as rivals more than allies. That division would shatter them when true war came. Dalinar spotted a cluster of Sadea's men training in formation nearby, their red and gold uniforms stark against the grey morning. His own officers kept their soldiers separate from them, wary. The enmity between the war camps was well known, but Dalinar was tired of it. He approached his son Adolin, who stood overseeing the drills.
Have them mix.
Dalinar ordered. Adolin frowned.
Father?
Pair our men with Sadeas's.
Dalinar commanded, his voice firm.
Have them train together, spar together, make them fight as one.
The captain hesitated.
That will not go over well.
It doesn't have to,
Dalinar said, and so it began. The soldiers resisted at first, old grudges flaring, but Dalinar stayed, watching, ensuring that his command was followed. Tension sparked, words were exchanged, fists even flew. But for the first time, men from rival war camps crossed blades, not as enemies, but as partners. It was a small thing, but unity had to start somewhere. The candlelight flickered against the smooth stone walls of Yasnar Kolin's private study, casting restless shadows across the shelves lined with ancient tomes. The scent of ink and parchment mixed with the faint salt of the Carbanthian Sea, drifting in through the open balcony doors. Shallan Davar sat stiffly at the desk, her fingers tight around the quill she had ceased using moments before. Across from her, Yasna turned a page of the leather-bound book in front of her, her face impassive, yet her sharp eyes flickered with something almost unreadable, an intensity that put Shallan on edge. The research had led them here, deeper than Shallan had anticipated. She had read of the Voidbringers before, dark creatures of myth, used in stories to frighten children or bolster the grandeur of old legends. In every account, they were described as monstrous, terrible beings that rained destruction upon mankind. Demonic figures in shadow, with glowing red eyes, bringing ruin in the wake of the high storms. But what she had just read contradicted everything she had been taught. The descriptions were too specific, too real. Her gaze fell again on the passages they had uncovered, inked in the careful script of scholars long dead. The Voidbringers were not shadows, nor were they nameless horrors from the darkness. They were the enemy we knew, the enemy who stood beside us, the ones we called our own. Shallan swallowed.
This cannot be right.
She said, her voice barely above a whisper.
The text, every text, depicts the Voidbringers as monsters. Nothing like this.
Yasna lifted an eyebrow.
And yet, here it is, over and over in separate records from different centuries.
She closed the book gently, resting her hand atop it.
Tell me, Shallan, what do you see in these descriptions?
Shallan hesitated, then forced herself to speak.
The Parshendi.
She admitted.
And the Parshmen.
The words hung between them, fragile yet undeniable. Yasna nodded, her expression unreadable.
Yes, the accounts are too consistent to dismiss. Every ancient text that truly describes the Voidbringers paints a picture not of monsters from the beyond, but of a people, a race. And these details, tall forms, smooth marbled skin, a connection to the rhythms of nature, all match the Parshendi.
She looked up suddenly, her breath catching.
You're saying the Parshmen are Voidbringers?
I am saying they could be.
Yasna corrected.
If they are, then what we have believed for millennia is a lie. The desolations were not fought against creatures that came from some unknown abyss. They were fought against a race we once knew, and perhaps still do.
Shallan stared at her, stunned.
But that would mean
that the Voidbringers are not gone.
Yasna finished. Her voice was calm, measured, but the weight of her words was suffocating.
They have merely been waiting.
Shallan's heart pounded against her ribs. The implications of that thought swirled in her mind like a storm, dark and violent. If this was true, if the Parshmen were connected to the Voidbringers, then every kingdom in Roshar was unknowingly housing the enemy. And if the Voidbringers were only dormant, then one day they would awaken. Kaladin sat atop a rock outcropping just outside the war camp, staring out over the shattered plains. The plateaus stretched endlessly before him, fractured and broken, just like the men forced to march across them. Evening had settled in, the sky bruised with the last remnants of the dying sun, and the air was thick with the lingering scent of sweat, leather, and dried blood. Behind him, Bridge 4 rested in their barracks, tending to wounds and whispering among themselves. They were still alive, for now. Kaladin had no illusions about their future. Sadeas and his officers would throw them onto the field again soon, more fodder for the Parshendi archers. He closed his eyes, feeling the ache in his limbs, the sting of fresh cuts, the weight of it, all pressing down on him. But something else stirred inside him too, something strange, a warmth that lingered after the exhaustion should have consumed him, a lightness that defied the bruises marring his skin. A familiar gust of wind rustled his hair, carrying with it the sound of laughter, high and musical.
You're thinking too much again,
Syl said. Kaladin cracked open an eye. The tiny spren floated before him, spinning in lazy circles through the air. She was barely more than a shimmer, a ribbon of light flitting from one breeze to the next.
Hard not to,
Kaladin muttered.
It's either that or let someone else do the thinking for me.
Syl giggled.
And wouldn't that just be a tragedy?
He sighed, rubbing his temples.
Syl, why are you different?
She stopped spinning, hovering just in front of him, tilting her head.
Different.
When we first met, you were simple. A spren playing tricks, stealing things, laughing at the way the world worked.
He frowned, watching her.
Now you ask questions. You think. You remember things.
Syl hesitated, drifting closer.
I'm not sure.
She admitted.
I feel like I'm waking up, like there's something I've forgotten, but it's just outside my reach.
Her voice grew softer.
But I know I'm supposed to be here with you.
Kaladin studied her, his mind turning over her words. She was changing. And so was he. He clenched his fists, recalling moments that defied explanation. The way he had healed faster than he should. The way he sometimes moved in battle. Faster, stronger, impossibly precise. The times when his exhaustion suddenly lifted, when he should have collapsed, but didn't. He turned his hand over, studying his palm. No glow, no light, just scars and calluses. He thought of the spheres back in camp. Sometimes, when he passed by them, they flickered. A troubling thought settled in his mind, one he couldn't shake. Syl wasn't just changing, she was changing because of him. Part 12. Life Before Death. The shattered plains lay in an eerie stillness, a silence so unnatural it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. The constant wail of the wind had subsided, replaced by the faint murmur of the Alethi war camps, a sound too distant to be more than a murmur. The vast plateaus extended toward the horizon, interrupted only by deep chasms that raked the stone like scars from battles long past. Deep below, in the uncharted depths where no human had ever ventured, the Parshendi gathered. They sought refuge in these chasms, creating a maze of shadow and rock inaccessible to the Alethi. Amidst the faint glow of gemstones set into the cavern walls, Eshonai stood resolute, her shard plate reflecting the light with an almost sentient heaviness. Tonight, it seemed to carry more weight than ever before, as if it was aware of the monumental decision she was about to make. All around her, the others watched silently, their eyes deep and dark, expressions hidden beneath the intricate patterns of their marbled skin. The soft rhythm of their collective presence filled the cavern, a meditative hum where each beat carried weight beyond words.
We must act soon,
declared one of the elders, his carapace bearing the scars of countless battles. His measured tone, steeped in the cadence of resolve, filled the space. Eshonai met his gaze steadily, even as uncertainty churned within her.
We will,
she replied, her voice merging with the unified rhythm of her people's song.
The storm comes.
As the gathered warriors' murmurs swelled into a harmonious anticipation, it was clear they had long debated this moment in quiet, hidden meetings. They had fought petty skirmishes over gem hearts for years. And to what end? Nothing. The Alethi would never relent. No treaty, concession, or battle could quench their insatiable thirst for war. Relentless and greedy, the humans posed a never-ending threat. Thus, the Parshendi had turned to older, forgotten ways, practices buried deep in their history and sung by only the oldest among them. A new form, a forgotten power. It would change them. The notion drifted through their ranks on the rhythm of expectation. Eshonai bowed her head and closed her eyes as the charged air in the chasm grew thick with unseen energy. The gemstones flickered, reacting to the growing tension. Yes, the new form would change them. It would make them stronger. But at what cost? She had caught fleeting glimpses and felt creeping shadows at the margins of her mind whenever she dwelled too long on what was coming. Though subtle changes were stirring beneath her skin, she had yet to commit fully. Around her, others began to shift, evolving into forms both different and, in some ways, darker. It would destroy them, some warned. A sharper pulse of sound now, underscored with deep-seated rage. Eshonai's hands tightened into fists. The Alethi had taken everything. They had crossed the seas to wage war on lands that were never theirs, slaughtering her people and shattering the delicate balance once maintained on these plains. How many battles had she fought? How many lives lost under her command? A whisper of doubt threaded its way through her determination. Something about this power, this looming storm, felt off. More than just a weapon, it was something ancient, mysterious, a force they scarcely understood. Would it truly make them stronger, or transform them into something unrecognizable? Her eyes lifted to the sky. Far above, stars began to fade behind an advancing wall of darkness. In the distance, an immense, terrible storm approached. A storm unlike any known before, not born of the origin or the familiar high storms. This was something new, something unnatural. The Everstorm was coming. Dalinar's gaze was fixed on the distant plateaus of the shattered plains. The land spread before him endlessly, a fractured expanse marked by deep chasms that cut through the golden stone like gaping wounds in the earth. The morning air was sharp and cool, still holding the scent of rain from the previous night's high storm. Leaning on the stone parapet, his fingers curled against the rough surface as if anchoring himself amid heavy thoughts. He had sensed it. Sadeas was planning something. Dalinar had observed the shifting of troops, the subtle alterations in the war effort, and the careful, almost rehearsed words of Sadeas as his alliances shifted like a brewing storm. Though Sadeas spoke of unity and victory for Alethkar, Dalinar knew him too well to be fooled. There was no honor left in that man. Behind him, the firm clank of metal boots announced Adelin's arrival. His son's golden shard plate shone brightly in the morning light, impeccably polished, though the blade at his waist still showed signs of battle. Adelin's brisk pace and tense stance betrayed barely contained frustration.
Father,
Adelin said, his tone tight.
We need to act. If Sadeas is moving against us...
I know,
Dalinar interjected calmly, though his mind raced. Once an ally who had stood beside Gevilar and fought honorably in the Unification War, Sadeas had become corrupted by power. To him, Dalinar was no longer a companion in arms, but an obstacle, a threat. Adelin stepped closer, his gauntleted hands clenched at his sides.
We can't wait for him to strike first.
Dalinar glanced at his son from the corner of his eye, recognizing Adelin's youthful passion and fire, mirroring his own earlier years, but understanding that passion alone wouldn't secure victory.
We move carefully,
Dalinar finally said.
We don't act without undeniable proof.
Adelin scowled.
And if proof comes too late?
Exhaling slowly, Dalinar let the cool morning air fill his lungs before turning back to the plains, where the sun threw long, looming shadows over the damp battlefield.
Then we must be ready.
War was inevitable, whether they welcomed it or not. Kaladin stood before Bridge 4 as the first light of dawn crept over the war camp, stretching long shadows across the tired, haggard faces of the men gathered there. The air was crisp, still holding traces of last night's high storm, and the stone beneath his feet remained moist with lingering rain. The men formed a loose semicircle, their familiar expressions of quiet resignation now intermingled with something new, expectation. They had transformed. Once seen merely as expendable bodies sent to die, faceless slaves forced to drag bridges under enemy fire, they now stood tall with squared shoulders and lifted chins. Their calloused hands, once only tools of survival, had learned the art of wielding spears. Bruised, scarred, and weary, they had become something greater. They were brothers, they were warriors, and for the first time, they looked to him, not just as another survivor, but as their leader. Kaladin swallowed hard as the weight of that responsibility pressed down on his chest. Doubt gnawed at him. Did he truly deserve this role?
You've all seen how things are shifting,
He began, his voice steady, despite the nervous churn in his gut.
the way we've changed.
He glanced down at the wooden practice spear in his grasp, before meeting their eyes again.
We're not simply bridgemen anymore.
A murmur of hesitant agreement rippled through the group. At the back, Moshe folded his arms, his lined face etched with skepticism.
We're still property, as far as Sadeas is concerned.
Kaladin met his challenge without faltering.
That changes today.
Silence fell, laden with unspoken possibilities. His gaze swept over his men. Rock standing solidly, his quiet strength forming the bedrock of their unity. Moash, arms crossed and ever brooding yet attentive. Teft, ever reflective. Scar, Dunny, and others whose wariness was now sharpened by resolve. Pete, Lopen, Shen, each one was his.
We've survived against all odds.
Kaladin continued, his voice growing more confident.
We've done what no bridge crew ever thought possible. And I promise you, we will no longer be used as cannon fodder.
A few murmurs of cautious agreement arose. With sudden determination, Kaladin gripped the spear tighter and slammed its butt into the ground. The resounding crack echoed through the crisp morning air.
Do you want to live?
He challenged, his eyes sweeping over each man, daring them not to look away.
Then fight for it.
This time, there was no hesitance. Determination sparked in their eyes, their tired stances straightened, and hands balled into fists. Not in despair, but in fierce resolve. Bridge 4 had come this far, and they were determined to go on fighting. Part 13, Strength Before Weakness. The shattered plains unfurled before them like an endless war zone, a rugged expanse of broken plateaus and yawning chasms that had claimed innumerable lives. The land itself bore the scars of past conflicts, a permanent testament to battle. Today, beneath a sky heavy with storm clouds, it was poised to witness yet another sorrow, or perhaps a wonder. Kaladin Stormblessed sensed it immediately, a subtle shift in the atmosphere and the oppressive weight of something far greater pressing down on his shoulders. It nestled within him, heavier than the bridge he was destined to bear. When the horns echoed across the encampment, their deep, resounding notes shaking the very earth under his feet, he realized that the coming confrontation was no ordinary clash. For decades, Dalinar Kholin had led his battle-weary troops into the maw of conflict. Alongside his brother, he had carved a path through Alethkar, dismantled the might of rival high princes during the Unification War, and fought battles infused with honor, even as others succumbed to darker ambitions. Yet now, standing atop the barren plateau of the tower and watching his shardblade effortlessly cut down ranks of Parshendi, a troubling unease began to fester within him. Doubt germinated. The enemy here was noticeably stronger, faster, and alarmingly prepared. Their fierce determination hinted at knowledge kept from him. Then, across the perilous chasm that separated him from the main encampments, he spotted distant banners of blue and gold, Sadeas's unmistakable colors. Relief flared at the thought of reinforcements, only to turn to terror when he saw the bridges being methodically retracted, not in disarray or defeat, but by cold and deliberate command. Dalinar's breath seized in his throat. Sadeas had betrayed him. This had never been a united assault. It had always been a cunning trap. Even the Parshendi sensed the shift. Their war chants deepened, their actions quickened, signaling that the tide was about to turn. Isolated and abandoned, Dalinar's forces teetered on the brink. Adolin staggered back toward him, his shardplate marred and his blade streaked with blood, following his father's gaze as he saw the bridges retreat. Kaladin had seen Sadeas' troops pull back, leaving Dalinar stranded and overwhelmed. In that moment, the unmistakable voice once more filled Kaladin's mind. At that instant, Kaladin's mind resonated with the unmistakable voice again.
I will protect those who cannot protect themselves.
Syl darted before him, a streak of glowing light, her shape more defined than ever before. He could see her face now, see the desperation in her expression. Before he knew it, he was sprinting as though the ground beneath him had transformed into a blur of stone and shadow. The ceaseless pounding of boots on the rough terrain filled his ears, a clamor that drowned out everything but the primal urge to survive. Each labored breath made the pressure in his chest intensify, a grim reminder that his defiance might mean death for him and his men. Still, driven by an indefinable resolve, he pressed on. Bridge 4, Teft, Moash, Rock, and the other men once dismissed as unworthy had rallied together with renewed determination. Then, as if summoned by destiny, a fresh volley of arrows pummeled from the main force, a deadly downpour of black-fletched shafts. There was no cover, no retreat, nothing to halt their deadly approach. Syl whipped around Kaladin in a frenzied whirl. A surge of stormlight ignited within Kaladin as sparking golden orbs were drawn from the air into his body. A wild torrent of energy far beyond his control. Instinct overtook thought. His body reacted as muscles tensed and his breath caught in his chest. He lunged forward, hoisting his shield just as the arrows began to strike. And then the impossible happened. The arrows curved in mid-air, as though the very wind had betrayed their course. Their path altered, drawn inexplicably toward him. They slammed into his shield in a violent succession, the force of their impact ripping through him and hurling him backward into the men trailing behind. The world spun. Pain flared through his ribs as the Parshendi, witnessing the surreal moment, chose to retreat. Gasping, Kaladin felt stormlight seeping from his skin, his hands trembling as he observed the shield where the arrows now lay jammed, clustered as though magnetized. Meanwhile, Dalinar's gleaming blade continued its fluid sweep amidst the chaos, felling another Parshendi warrior as it danced in its relentless arc. His troops were faltering. He could sense the growing despair as the crushing weight of betrayal descended. They had fought longer than anyone could have hoped, yet without reinforcements or even a hint of renewed hope, they now teetered on the edge of collapse. Suddenly, amid the swirling confusion, emerged a determined, solitary force, a group of figures who, defying the urge to flee, charged headlong into the heart of battle. Dalinar turned, halted by the sight of Bridge 4 advancing, led by a man once deemed inconsequential. And there he was, Kaladin's Storm-Blessed. Dalinar, who had witnessed the heroic deeds of the era's finest warriors, now beheld Kaladin moving with such fluid grace and tempest-like energy that it seemed the very winds conspired to steer his spear. In that moment, Dalinar understood. This was no ordinary assault. It was the embodiment of something transcendent, something beyond mundane warfare. A Parshendi warrior lunged at Kaladin, his shimmering shard blade aimed for a fatal blow. Dalinar rushed to intercept, but was a heartbeat too late. Kaladin moved with an almost supernatural grace, as if time itself had slowed. The battlefield receded until only the enemy and his steadfast resolve remained. With a leap that defied mortal limits, Kaladin took to the air. For one suspended heartbeat, he hung aloft, stormlight bursting in brilliant flashes through his veins, as if an unseen force cradled him. Then, the inevitable came. He crashed down spear first, toppling a Parshendi and sending shockwaves rippling across the scarred earth. Dalinar looked on, breath stolen by wonder, as Kaladin's once radiant aura dimmed into palpable exhaustion. As the turmoil of battle finally subsided, Dalinar found himself amid the smouldering ruins, his shard plate battered and his body racked with pain. Yet around him, his men held firm, bloodied but unyielding, owing their survival to the singular act of one man. Turning toward the bridgeman, Dalinar saw not just a soldier, but a savior. Kaladin knelt, utterly spent, his weary hands resting on his trusted spear as his chest rose and fell with each hard-won breath. In an act that shattered convention, Dalinar stepped forward and, with the humility of a servant, sank to his knees beside him. The ensuing silence resounded louder than any battle cry. Part 14. Journey Before Destination. Far from the war camps, deep within the grand halls of Kharbranth's Palaneum, Shallan sat in the gentle glow of infused spheres, her sketchbook open before her. The vast library was quiet at this hour. The usual clamour of scholars and scribes had dwindled to the occasional rustle of parchment and the soft scratch of quills, a background hum she barely noticed. The pages under her fingertips were filled with delicate, exact illustrations, scenes that should have been impossible. She had drawn them as if copying from a text, yet no tome in Yasna's extensive collection held such images. A battle, long past. Figures clad in luminous armor moved with an otherworldly elegance, their forms radiating light. Enormous swords did not merely slice through flesh, but seemed to cut something deeper, unseen. These were the knights radiant. She had heard the name whispered in childhood stories and woven into ancient myths. Until now, such tales had been mere legends. Turning the pages carefully, she scrutinized the complexity of her sketches. Some were based on murals and faded carvings within the library's recesses. Others, those had come from her own mind. She couldn't fathom how she recalled them. She shouldn't have been able to. Her fingers traced the 10-pointed star, the emblem of the Knights Radiant, a symbol she had seen before, not only in books, but somewhere else, beyond the physical realm, in the very space where she had once fallen.
Shadesmar.
A chill ran through her. She flipped through her notes, comparing them with her discoveries. The Fabrials, the Soulcasters, and the inexplicable way Yasna wielded her power. Every clue pointed to something hidden, something buried under centuries of forgotten lore. Could it be true? Were the Radiants more than mere legends? Had they finally returned? She reached for her sketchbook, flipping to a fresh page, but suddenly she felt a shift in the air. Not the wind, something else. The sensation of being watched. Shallan froze, her charcoal poised above the page. Slowly, subtly, she turned her head. No one was there. She clenched her jaw and continued sketching, forcing herself to ignore the prickling at the back of her neck. The Ghostbloods were always watching. She had stepped too deep into their world, and she knew that once they took notice of someone, they never stopped watching. But Shallan had no intention of leaving just yet. Not until she discovered what she came for. Not until she had saved her family. The battlefield was still thick with the scent of blood and death, the echoes of war lingering in the air like ghosts that refused to be forgotten. The tower had been won, not by strategy, nor by the might of Alethi shard-bearers, but by a single impossibility. Kaladin Stormblessed had turned the tide. Dalinar Kholin stood in the aftermath, his shard plate cracked, his body bruised and exhausted, but unbowed. He had spent a lifetime in war, leading soldiers into battle, carving out a kingdom in the name of his brother. But today, something had shifted. He turned to the man who had made that change possible, the bridgeman who should have died, who had been nothing in the eyes of the nobility, and yet had saved them all.
You saved my life,
Dalinar said, his voice firm, carrying the weight of the moment. Kaladin was still kneeling, his breath ragged, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. Blood and sweat streaked his face, but his eyes remained steady as they met Dalinar's gaze.
It was the right thing to do.
Dalinar nodded. He had already made his decision.
You, Kaladin Stormblessed, and all of your bridge crew are no longer slaves. From this day forward, you serve in my guard, my personal bodyguard.
Murmurs rippled through the assembled soldiers. A dark eyes granted such a position? A bridgeman placed above light-eyed officers? It was unheard of. But Dalinar did not waver. He looked beyond Kaladin at the men of Bridge 4. They had been used as fodder, treated as disposable, but they had survived where others had not. They had followed Kaladin into battle, not because they had been ordered to, but because they had believed in him. And Dalinar believed in him too.
From now on,
he said, his voice carrying across the plateau,
we follow the codes.
Honor had been nearly lost on the shattered plains. He would not let it be lost again. Kaladin had spent years distrusting Light Eyes, and for good reason. They had betrayed him, used him, sold him. And now, one knelt before him. Dalinar Kholin, High Prince of War, had bowed to a bridgeman. The sight of it rattled Kaladin more than the battle had. He had fought for freedom, not just for himself, but for his men. And now, he had it. But what would he do with it? He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt uncertain. Stormlight still burned within him, though it was weak now, flickering like a candle in the wind. He could feel it waiting, whispering, something just beyond his understanding. Syl hovered near him, her tiny form glowing in the dim light.
You must speak the words,
she said softly.
Words.
Kaladin frowned, but deep down, he already knew. The wind stirred around him. The oaths of the Radiance were not mere phrases. They were promises, ideals, truths that defined those who spoke them. And though he did not yet fully understand what he was becoming, he knew what he must say.
I will protect those who cannot protect themselves.
The words left his lips, and the world ignited. Stormlight surged through him, flooding every fiber of his being. His wounds sealed, his exhaustion vanished, his strength renewed. It was more than power. It was purpose. The throne room lay in stillness, the air thick with unspoken tension. The golden light of infused spheres flickered against polished stone, casting elongated shadows. At the center of it all, King Elhokar sat, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair in a restless rhythm. Dalinar stood before him, his posture rigid despite the weight of exhaustion pressing on his shoulders. The sting of betrayal still burned. Sadeas had left him to die, had proven that even among allies, ambition outweighed honor. But that was not the only problem plaguing Alethkar. But Elhokar's paranoia had festered too long. Dalinar studied him, the way he clutched the signet ring on his finger, the way his breath quickened. He was not Gavilar. His brother, the king's father, had commanded loyalty by sheer presence, had ruled with strength. But Elhokar ruled through fear, fear of losing control, fear of being seen as weak. Dalinar took a slow step forward.
You want to know the truth?
Before the king could respond, Dalinar reached out and ripped the golden plate from Elhokar's shoulder. The metal clattered to the floor. Elhokar gasped, lurching back, his eyes wide with shock. Dalinar turned the piece over in his hands. It gleamed in the lantern light, untouched. Not scratched, not cracked. No sign of sabotage.
You are not weak because assassins are hunting you,
Dalinar said, his tone like tempered steel. He tossed the plate to the ground, the sound ringing through the chamber.
You are weak because you believe you are.
Elhokar's expression flickered, indignation warring with something else, uncertainty. Dalinar exhaled, his voice quieter now.
You need to trust someone, Elhokar. Trust me, or this kingdom will fall.
Silence stretched between them as outside the high winds began to blow. Part 15. The Words of Radiance. The sun sank low over the Kharbranth, Zrenia in shades of gold and crimson. Perched upon the balcony next to Yasna Kholin, Shallan clutched her sketchbook tightly. A breeze tugged at her cloak, while the distant sounds of soldiers in the valley whispered by, though she barely registered them as her thoughts raged like a personal storm. Everything was coming into focus. After weeks spent poring over worn tomes and obscure manuscripts, she had gathered a crucial puzzle. The Oath Gates, the Knights Radiant, and truths buried beneath centuries of oblivion. Now, standing here, she felt closer than ever to an answer. Yasna gazed at the horizon with an inscrutable look and murmured,
Power is knowledge, and you have learned much.
Shallan swallowed hard. Knowledge had always been her fiercest weapon, and the means by which she had claimed her place in the world.
Is it enough?
She whispered. Yasna turned, her piercing eyes locking onto hers.
That depends,
she replied.
It depends on whether you can survive what comes next.
For months, Shallan had been under Yasna's meticulous guidance, studying history, philosophy, logic, and science. But tonight, their discoveries had taken on a different dimension. Yasna's voice lowered as she ran her fingers over the delicate pages of an ancient tome.
The Knights Radiant were not what we believed.
Shallan's breath caught.
Then, what were they?
Meeting her gaze steadily, Yasna answered,
Patience, child. The truth will unveil itself in time.
With a soft thump, Yasna closed the book, her guarded expression betraying a reluctance to reveal more. A look that unnerved Shallan deeply. The sun sank low over Kharbranth, painting the land in shades of gold and crimson. In the cold night corridors of the Palanium, where flicking torches barely dispelled the darkness, Shallan moved with her sketchbook pressed hard to her chest, and her mind racing with newfound knowledge. She had found monumental evidence that the Radiance had left behind more than mere legends. Their wisdom had not been lost, only concealed. She craved more texts, more records, more truth. A sudden gust of wind flirted with her cloak as she rounded a corner toward her quarters. The grand library lay nearly deserted at this hour, the sporadic patter of footsteps and murmured conversations from afar, the only signs of life. Shallan halted mid-step as the air grew heavy and different, and a subtle movement behind her caught her attention, a fluctuation in the torchlight. Spinning around, with her heart pounding, she saw the shadows shift, and a smooth, knowing voice emerge.
You've been asking too many questions.
Her breath hitched as a figure stepped into the dim firelight, a faint, sharp smile curving on their lips.
Come with me,
the figure said.
We need to talk.
The Ghostbloods had found her. In the quiet of the barracks, disturbed only occasionally by the murmurs of soldiers drifting off to sleep, Kaladin sat alone on his cot. The soft glow of an infused sphere cast long shadows across the stone floor, while a weight, heavier than any bridge, pressed down on his shoulders. Bodyguard to a high prince. Alight eyes, his fingers clenched into tight fists as old bitterness stirred within him. Years of watching men like Dalinar Kholin use and discard people like him, all while playing at honor, had left their mark. And now he was expected to protect one such man. Kaladin exhaled slowly, yet the inner turmoil persisted. Across from him, Syl hovered, a faint light shifting gracefully between forms as she regarded him with gentle concern.
You know what you need to do,
she urged softly. He ran a hand over his weathered, calloused face. Did he? Had he already made his choice? He had saved Dalinar at the tower, defied orders, and led Bridge 4 into an almost hopeless battle because he couldn't stand by and see men die. And yet, this situation felt different. His role, protecting Dalinar, was not a single desperate charge. It was a daily, burdensome promise. Could he uphold this duty? Could he trust Dalinar? And ultimately, could he trust himself? Glancing down at his scarred hands, the same hands that had once gripped spears in defiance of Light Eye's rule, fighting to liberate the oppressed, he wondered if protecting one of them was a betrayal, or perhaps something more profound. Syl edged closer, her voice barely audible.
Together, we can protect them all.
Kaladin sighed, thumb rubbing across his palm as old wounds throbbed with phantom pain. He wasn't sure he could ever truly trust Dalinar, but one truth remained clear. Dalinar had knelt before a bridgeman, a gesture no other Light Eyes would offer. Perhaps that was enough. Sethson Naturo stood on the edge of a rooftop, with the wind howling around him like the cry of a forgotten god. His loose white robes whipped about his body as the cold air stung his skin. Below, the war camps of the shattered plains sprawled in every direction, the warm glow of infused spheres outlining the grand tents of Alethi nobility. Somewhere among them lay his next target.
Dalinar Kholin.
Closing his eyes, Seth drew a steady breath. He had slain countless men, kings, high lords, warriors, and the echoes of their screams were etched into his soul. But this time, something was different. He had studied Dalinar, listening to whispered accounts from Light Eyes and spies. Dalinar was no ordinary man. He was honorable in a way few could be. Truly honorable. He was the kind of man the world needed. Gripping his arms tightly, Seth gritted his teeth. He did not wish to kill Dalinar, yet he felt he had no alternative. His Oathstone bound him. His will was not his own. In the end, he was merely a tool, a weapon assigned a target he could not choose. As the storm raged around him, its winds attempting to hold him back and pull him away from his fated course, he stepped forward nonetheless. He had no choice. A truthless obeys without question. And so, the assassin in white leapt out into the tempest.